Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another one of our social emotional workshops. Today, we are with the Avalon Healing Center, and they're going to be talking about human trafficking. Meredith, we are so glad to have you. Welcome aboard, and you can go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me this afternoon. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I've got a few slides, and then I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time for discussion or any questions that you all might have. I would be curious, since there are just a few of us, if you could introduce yourselves and sort of tell me your role and like the age of students that you work with.
Well, we work with students from K all the way through 12.
Okay.
And so everyone here is either a teacher, a coach, a mentor, an advocate, and we're just glad to have you present on such a important topic.
Awesome. So you all are the folks who can make a difference in young people's lives and sort of catch this before it gets too bad.
Well, we try.
Yeah, my mom was a high school teacher for 30 years, so I have a whole lot of respect for what you guys do. So let's jump right in. If I can make my screen work. There we go. So I know my screen says Benita, but my name's Meredith. I'm a social worker, and I'm Avalon Healing Center's human trafficking program coordinator. I'll share a little more information on Avalon and like what we do sort of toward the end. But we are a nonprofit that serves survivors of sexual violence. So my knowledge when it comes to trafficking is more around sex trafficking than labor trafficking. But labor trafficking is very much a big and present issue. It just doesn't tend to get the same kind of attention as sex trafficking. But I'll sort of be providing information on both today. So what is it? Well, human trafficking, it's a crime. It's a human rights violation. It's a public health issue. And it sort of, at the end of the day, is this manifestation in a person, like in their life, of all of these much larger systems of oppression in our society. There's a lot of misinformation out there when it comes to trafficking. So let's kind of get into it. Most basically, human trafficking is just compelled labor and exploitation. So it can affect men, women, or children, and they are forced to work. So human trafficking, like I said, it's an umbrella term. There's sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. Sometimes sex trafficking is referred to as commercial sexual exploitation. And human trafficking is the second largest criminal industry in the world and the fastest growing. That is second only to drugs and arms dealing. But it's growing a lot faster because if you think about it, if I'm selling guns or drugs, I constantly have to get new products. But if I'm using one person over and over and over again, exploiting them, then I don't have to do that work to constantly be getting and moving product in the same way. Human trafficking is also really difficult, or can be really difficult to see. If I get pulled over and there's a gun on my front seat or a bag of drugs, that's pretty obvious. But if I get pulled over and there's just a person in the car with me who's not saying anything, well, who's to say I'm doing anything wrong with them? So it's kind of something that happens like in plain sight. And it certainly is happening here in Michigan. So these are the formal definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. You can see they're very similar. One thing that I like to point out is that these federal definitions of trafficking didn't exist until the year 2000. So really, of course, we know trafficking has been going on a lot longer than that, but technically, legally, this crime didn't exist until then. So it's a very young movement, the anti-trafficking movement, sort of much like the domestic violence movement was like 40 years ago. Like we're really sort of in the nascent stages of it. And you can see these definitions too. It's sort of like, all right, Force, fraud, or coercion, what does that mean? It's really difficult to prove legally too. So it's a very interesting field to be in now as it's sort of evolving and changing. Another important thing to point out on this page is under sex trafficking, you see that last line there. The person induced to perform such an act has not yet attained 18 years of age. So that basically is telling us there's no such thing as a child prostitute. A child cannot consent to do any of that. Any child trading sex for anything of value, whether that's a place to stay or an iPad or a pair of shoes, really anything, is legally considered a victim of trafficking. So some of the biggest myths, there's a ton of misinformation. The biggest myth out there is that traffickers target strangers. I'm sure you've seen those posts on Facebook with the zip ties on your car, or if you see a van like this, there might be kids in it that they're trying to sell. But the reality is that traffickers really target people that they know. Trafficking is a big business, and if someone is, getting plucked out of a Kroger parking lot, chances are people will come looking for them. So that's not really good for business. Generally, traffickers go after people in their own circle, in their neighborhoods, who are vulnerable. Really, they're just looking to exploit any vulnerabilities that exist. It's not just acquaintances or shady people. Familial trafficking is actually quite common, particularly in young kids, especially boys. And recruitment by a family member is really very common for people involved in the life. It's hard to believe, but it's something that we do see. This is something families will often get involved trafficking their children to support like a drug habit. So you do see a lot of overlap between like substance use and trafficking. But this is the kidnapping myth is a very pervasive myth when it comes to trafficking. And I think a lot of that comes from, our cultural touch point is the movie Taken. And there's not a whole lot of truth to that. It really is people in their own networks or people who they build relationships with, not people that they're just pulling off the street. Not to say that kidnapping never happens. It can happen even in these trafficking situations. But everyone that I have worked with who has been kidnapped by a trafficker was sort of already either they had run away from home or they were substance dependent and, were kidnapped by their drug dealer. So you're not really seeing that people just being pulled off the street and thrown into these vans. Another big myth is that for it to be trafficking, a person has to be moved across borders. Smuggling can turn into trafficking, and trafficking can involve movement, but smuggling is a crime against the border of a sovereign nation, and trafficking is a crime against a person. And so with trafficking, you have to have that force, fraud, or coercion, where oftentimes when people are smuggled, they know they're being smuggled, they want to be smuggled. But like I said, that can turn into trafficking where, there's some sort of debt that has to be repaid and someone's forced to work it off. But someone can be trafficked just totally in their own home. I see a hand raised. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
When it says they have to be moved across borders, are those state lines or are they country lines?
Oh, this is a myth. This is a myth. So they do
Okay.
not need to be
That's a
moved
myth.
across.
I missed that part.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Well, see, I know. So when I first made these slides, people were like, oh, that's sort of confusing. So I put the big myth on there. But so for smuggling, it has to be moved across country lines. For trafficking, it's true that sometimes people are moved and there are some corridors. particularly from like Southeast Michigan across 94 to Chicago. That's a track that people will do a lot, or down 75 into Tennessee is something. And it's true that the traffickers will move people around to sort of try to avoid detection or meet demand. But you can be trafficked and never leave, you know, your 8-block radius of your neighborhood, and it's still trafficking. So, of course, another big myth is that trafficking doesn't happen here. Trafficking is a faraway problem. It happens in Thailand. It happens in, I don't know, wherever else. But it does. It does happen here. The US is what's considered a bi-directional country. So that means that people from other countries are brought here and exploited, and that people who are born and raised here are exploited here. So Polaris, which I'll share their info for you all in the chat, they are a big national group that basically does all of the research and reporting on human trafficking in the US. And they, for the state of Michigan, most victims who were identified in Michigan were US citizens. They were US nationals, followed by Mexico and the Philippines. And this is a map from Polaris. So they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that number is 888-3737-888. And that is a sort of like a clearinghouse. You can call them if you suspect trafficking and want to report it. And you can call them to look for resources. And they're based in DC, and they do all this research, and you can see this heat map from their calls. I think this is from 2019, this particular map. They kind of haven't been updating it so much, but you can see pretty much everywhere where there are people, they get calls. So it is very much something that happens here. And here are some headlines just to indicate that it does happen here. And not just in the city, you know, it happens all over the state. Now, this is one of my favorite diagrams. So a lot of times people think about trafficking as like, how does that happen? Like, that doesn't, you know, people, it can be something that's hard for them to wrap their head around. And it's not just an individual problem, you know, it's not like a couple of bad actors. This is very much a societal, cultural problem. And you can see there are risk factors at every level. Of course, some individuals are going to be more susceptible to being trafficked. Those people who are more likely to be trafficked have some sort of basic vulnerabilities, whether they're low income, whether they have low self-esteem. I would say the literature says that about like 95% of folks who are trafficked for sex have a history of childhood sexual abuse. In my practice, I've found that every single one of them does have some history of childhood sexual abuse. So that early trauma is something that can make someone more vulnerable to being trafficked later in their lifetime. Homeless or runaway youth, that's a huge one. Of course, we know that kids get approached on the street. You know, if they're out there, they will be approached. And then under that, you see LGBTQ as a risk factor, which was something that never really sat well with me. But the reality is that those are the kids who are often, you know, disowned. They don't have the family support, so they do end up leaving and going elsewhere for that support. So there's the individual level. Then of course there's the family level risk factors. Any kind of family conflict or disruption can make someone more vulnerable to trafficking. Community risk factors. This one is huge. The social norms is a really important piece, because it's sort of, pimping is sort of glorified in our culture. You know, historically it has been, and there is still sort of some allure around that. and this ability to make money so quickly. I've talked to plenty of people, teenagers even, who were involved, and they tell me, I know it was wrong, but I loved him and I love the money and I love the lifestyle and all my friends were doing it. And it was just a thing that we did. And, you know, we're talking about like 16, 17-year-old kids who are involved in this stuff. And then of course you have the much larger like societal risk factors. But it is a system problem. It's not sort of an individual problem. And slowly the field is moving that way. The anti-trafficking movement really started as like a criminal justice movement, like focused on catching the bad guys. But it's really hard to catch these bad guys. They're really smart. And so now we're kind of finally moving into this understanding of trafficking as like a public health issue and something that, you know, needs to be addressed early and often. And that's sort of where you all come in. What do we do? How do we actually protect kids from being exploited? The number one thing, and I'm sure you all know this, but the number one thing that you can do is really build their self-esteem, build their self-worth, and be a stable, non-judgmental, open, safe person in their lives. Because all the research shows the number one protective factor for a child from any form of violence later in their lifetime, whether it's gang violence, trafficking, whatever, the number one protective factor is having one single supportive adult in their life. One adult, one healthy adult relationship where they feel safe processing emotions, where they're not shamed, where they're not judged. One adult. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, it could be a mentor. Just having one supportive adult is the best thing for a child as they sort of like grow up in this world and move on their way. Another thing that I know is sort of tough in Michigan is age-appropriate sex ed. And that can start in kindergarten, you know, teaching the proper names for body parts. What is safe touch? You know, as you get into high school, what does a healthy relationship look like? Being real with them about things like sexting, you know, that's like one way that we see high schoolers sort of getting roped into trafficking a lot is what's called like sextortion, where, you know, they'll take a nude photo of themselves, send it to someone who they think is their boyfriend or flirting with them, whatever. And then they have this image and that can be used to exploit them. Hey, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to send this picture to your dad, or I'm going to put this, you know, on social media. I'm going to tell everyone that you send nudes, you know, or whatever. But that's something like really common that we see with high schoolers. And then also being honest with them about like, you've got nude pictures of someone on your phone and they're a child, that can be considered child pornography. So having these sort of uncomfortable or difficult conversations and being real with them is really important for prevention. And then trying to provide them with a sense of like, you know, the world is big. There's a lot that you can do. You don't have to stay in the same 4 blocks for your whole life, you know. Giving them that sort of sense of wonder and opportunity is hugely important. And so that's kind of all the stuff, because I know we don't have a ton of time. So really quickly, I'll tell you sort of what we do at Avalon, and then I want to field any questions that you might have. So Avalon, we're a nonprofit. We're located in Detroit, right between Tech and the Masonic Temple. All of our services totally free, totally confidential. We provide services to all survivors of sexual violence, not just trafficking. So part of what we do is we do all the rape kits in Wayne County, and that's 24/7, 365. That's our pager number. We have medical follow-up services. We've got a clinic. We can do expert witness testimony in those cases. We do counseling and advocacy. We'll go with people to court, individual counseling, group counseling. For trafficking survivors, we've got case management services, so we can help people with goal setting and getting connected to more resources. We also have some financial assistance available for trafficking survivors. And then, of course, we are happy to speak at any meetings or outreach and training stuff. Here's my info. I know we've only got 5 minutes, but what questions do you all have? Or are there more resources that I can share?
Actually, Meredith, you have the hour.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, you have until 3. And
Oh.
I would love to see more resources. And I wanted to ask, under the list of services you provide,
Mhm.
counseling, is there a fee for that to people who
Nope,
would need it?
it's all totally free. The only thing that you need is to identify as a survivor of sexual violence at any time. You know, it could even be this happened to me 10 years ago, and now I'm ready to talk about it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we try to make everything you know, accessible and low barrier, and sort of let people know that we're always here, we're always available to provide these services, because it's something that, you know, people have a hard time talking about. Like as a victim, as a survivor, like coming forward can feel really challenging. And then even like as a professional, knowing, oh, like, what do I do with this kind of disclosure? And so I guess I can talk about that a little bit. If you do, you know, if someone does tell you that they've been sexually assaulted or that they're being exploited, the number one thing that you can do is affirm and believe, you know, affirm them and believe them, and then get them connected to any other resources that are out there. I would have used my longer slides if I had realized I had the hour, but I think something that might be helpful for you all is thinking about, like, okay, what would I be looking for in a student? Like, how would I suspect trafficking?
Right, what signs?
What are the signs? What might we see? And so it kind of depends on their age. So for like the little ones, like, you know, under 12, you might see some sort of like regressive behavior, like acting younger than they should. They might go back to like wetting themselves. Of course, being withdrawn, being really tired, more outbursts. Really, you're looking for, and this is true across all ages, you're looking for changes in behavior. And so the little ones, it tends to be more, I don't want to say obvious, but like more sort of like, okay, you're wetting yourself, you're yelling more, you're having more meltdowns, you're maybe falling asleep in class, you're not playing the way that you usually do. And then in high school, similarly, you're looking for those changes. So have their grades dropped? Are they not handing in assignments and they used to do it all the time? Physically, are they presenting differently? So like that can be a big part of that sort of grooming process. Because a lot of times for high school age folks, how this happens is through a fake boyfriend, you know, like a fraudulent love story kind of. And so you might hear a student talking about a new older boyfriend. They might have their hair done or their nails done a lot more to, you know, to try to make them look a little bit older. They might be falling asleep in class or just not showing up. Like if they stop showing up, that's, you know, a sign that there could be something else going on. So those are, they might have more money. They might be talking about having more money, or have like, I don't know, new expensive clothes or bags or things that you might see. So those are kind of the big thing is just looking for a change. And I mean, I'm sure you all do that already, and then can sort of tell when like maybe there's some wonder what's going on with this kid, because he's not being his usual self. Oh, students on the street. So are most of your students in like Southeast Michigan, or are they sort of all over?
Actually, they're all over. We have them in Pontiac, we have them in Monroe, we have them in Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
Mine that I was the one that said the question, are in Detroit, in the Detroit area. I have a lot of 18. It's amazing. I have 18-year-old. I can't tell you how many right now. More than a handful that they're 18. They hit 18 and the family's like, out you go.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Bye-bye. And they're just, oh my gosh, they've had, not that they had it much better at home. They've been a victim of, there has been sexual trauma for sure.
Sure.
But it's like, I didn't know if you had like referrals to places that you send if you come across students like that.
So for young women, there's alternatives for girls. Put that in the chat there. And Alternatives for Girls is great. They do street outreach. They started as a street outreach organization, so like very much focused on the trafficking stuff. And then they expanded to do more prevention, after school programs, and they do have a shelter. And it's for young women who are up to 21. And they will also take small children. So like if you've got any students who have babies, I think they'll take children up to 4 years old. So they will take like, mothers and children. So that's one. Covenant House is another. They are national. So they have locations everywhere, but they've got one in Detroit that's right on MLK and one of the freeways. I always mix up all my freeways. I'm not from here. But Covenant House is a good one, and I believe they serve youth up to 24, both all genders. Those are the only like youth Ruth Ellis Center as another one. And they actually just opened new sort of like transitional semi-independent housing, and they will serve youth. They define youth as up to like 30, which I appreciate. But they are focused on LGBTQ folks. But they've also got a drop-in center. They do have like trafficking specific services too. And they're in Highland Park. So those are the youth serving groups around here that I am aware of. And then of course, like I'd imagine most teens who are kicked out will sort of like couch surf around a little bit, which technically is not homeless. So there is a hotline. It's called CAM, and I can find their phone number, but that's meant to be the coordinated access model. Yeah, CAM. It's really it's meant to be like a clearinghouse where they have all of the information on all of the shelters and are supposed to be able to get people placed right away. Unfortunately, in reality, it doesn't really function that way. They will, if you call them. I think Wednesdays are the day that they're open late, but typically their hotline ends at 5. And so that's kind of where you got to go to get into any of the shelters, is through CAM. And they're the ones who handle all of that placement. Housing, I think, is one of the biggest gaps in services that we see here. Like it's such a big need for our trafficking population, but also, you know, our general sexual assault population. Housing is a really, really major need here. And I think there are more groups trying to do more housing stuff, but right now those are kind of the big ones. What other questions do you have about trafficking, or have you guys encountered this with any of your students, or maybe sexual violence more generally?
You guys feel free to unmute.
Oh yeah.
I'm curious, with the places, the like homeless shelters, if there's not like a spot for somebody, do they usually try to help them find somewhere else?
Yeah, so yeah, they do, but the other options are not great. So really what it is, you used to be able to go to CAM, now they've returned to only hotline. You call and you sort of explain, you give your basic demographic info and identify, like if you are part of like a special population, you can like identify that, like a survivor of domestic violence, trafficking, or sexual assault. Because that, for those shelters, you can call them directly. So those are Turning Point, Haven, First Step. I do have a full like shelter list for Michigan that I can share with you all. And so those, you can call them directly rather than going through CAM. I've never gotten anyone placed in a specialty shelter in Detroit because they're always full. I've had more luck sending people out to like Bay City, like the Bay City Women's Center, or Blue Water Safe Horizons in Port Huron. But typically those shelters it's 18 and up. So you can call those and try to get in there. CAM will try to place you in a shelter. So there are several large shelters in Detroit and the, Tri-County area. But as it's getting colder, those are sort of filling up. And so the alternative that they give you, they won't send you home with nothing. But your alternative essentially is going to a warming center, which a lot of the time ends up being a bunch of chairs in a room and you're sort of just in a chair, or like, so at least you're inside, but it's not really a proper shelter placement. It's really just okay, you're here for tonight and then you have to leave during the day, and then you could come back at night so that you're not outside. But obviously that is a situation that's less than ideal. So you can see why a lot of people, even if they are fleeing violence, they say, well, screw that, I don't want to do that. I'll go on the street. I'll go back to my abuser. Because that's better than what's available.
Meredith, do you know whether or not there is, okay, say like the homeless student is from Detroit, but there are no openings in the shelters in Detroit. Are there residency requirements from other outlining shelters in order to get in? In other words, they say, well, you have to be a resident of Oakland County in order to get in this.
It depends on the type of shelter. So some of them, yes, like the larger, like general shelters, yes. The ones that are specifically related to sexual violence or domestic violence, not necessarily, but it depends on who picks up the phone. Because I've tried calling a shelter one day and saying, I'm calling from Detroit, and they said, sorry, we can't help you. And then for the same person called the next day, didn't say where we were calling from, and they said, oh yeah, that's fine. So that's another big issue, is all of these inconsistencies in this continuum of care model that we're working in. But yeah, there is sort of a residency requirement for most of the shelters. So again, it's sort of like, okay, well, if there's nothing here and I don't want to go to a warming center and I'm an 18-year-old, of course I'm gonna couch surf. I'm gonna go between all my friends as much as I can, and then maybe I would do a favor for a stranger for a place to stay, you know?
What is the difference between a warming center and a shelter?
So a warming center, well, so in like deep winter, they'll open warming centers where people can just come in and sit all day. A shelter tends to have some sort of like programming along with it. If you're in a shelter, you'll have your own room. Well, not your own, you probably will have roommates, but like you'll be sort of situated there for whatever length of stay, whether it, you know, every shelter has their own rules, whether it's 30, 90, however many days. Some of the specialized shelters have longer stays allowed and then have sort of step down from like shelter to transitional housing. But a warming center is not like you wouldn't have your own room, you wouldn't be able to leave your belongings there. It's very much like you're just coming in and staying overnight so that you're out of the cold, versus a shelter where, you know, you could receive mail there for the time while you're there. You have your own room.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have any more questions? All right, then we will bring the session to a close. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Meredith, for giving presentation. It was excellent presentation, a lot of great information. And I would love that list of, if you could send it to me, and I'll make sure that I publish this with our staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. I hope none of your students need our services, but if they do, you know, we're here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you guys again for joining. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you all.
All right. Bye.